Now I'd like to introduce Professor Shelly Mallet. Shelley is the Professorial Fellow in Social Policy in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and she's also General Manager of Research and Policy at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. Shelley's research interests include homelessness, youth transitions in and out of home care and similar settings, and gender and health inequities. I first heard Shelley speak at a John Cain Foundation lunch that was held earlier this year, and she spoke on how a universal basic income might be utilised to support youth transitions in the precarious years of early adulthood. I was extremely impressed by her thoroughgoing and measured analysis of the pros and cons of universal income, which, as you're possibly aware, remains a fairly contentious issue amongst policymakers. Shelley has had a career both as a practitioner and as an academic that has spanned service delivery, service development and research and teaching at the Australian National University and La Trobe University. Somewhat similarly to Jim, she also has a prodigious research output. Her selected publications page on her university website refers to over 50 journal articles and major reports, and I'm certain that that's not the full extent of them.
How can the social welfare system support equity and build social mobility? First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight with you and to discuss issues after the talking, which I think will be more important than the speech itself. And just I want to say a few quick comments about the social welfare system in Australia, because I immediately came to grief with that, can you fix the social welfare system? And I had to ask myself, what is it actually? And so I just wanted to, oops, let's see if this works. So I just wanted to reiterate that all of you will know in Australia that it's a pretty complex thing in Australia, the social welfare system. What's in it and what's out of it, and where it lies is something that we always need to take into account. And it's been clearly designed to mitigate the effects of poverty, inequality, and it's quite complex, divided between the states and the territories, and delivered in large part until relatively recently by the not-for-profits, and before that other forms of charities. But it's an increasingly shifting market, I guess, in terms of where the social welfare system is provided by the actors that provide it. Increasingly we see the rise of for-profits in the space, and especially in the state and territory funded child protection, the justice, there's some emerging involvement in the homelessness system, and in more recent big systems of growth, the National Disability Insurance Scheme and consumer directed care. Oops. I want to say just a little bit about the centrepiece of Australia's welfare system, the income support system, and its close cousin, the employment service system. And just to say a little bit about its complexity, there's actually about 20 income support payments, and nearly 55 supplementary payments delivered under the income support system under the Commonwealth Government. And there's significant differences between payment levels and between categories. And the other point to make is that at 19.1% of GDP, Australian social spending is not high compared with the OECD average of 21%. So I'd like to say a little bit about the inadequacy of social security payments. So Australia has the most targeted social security system in the OECD, and with a rising gap between pensions and allowances, and by allowances I mean New Start, the unemployment benefit, and the youth allowance, it reinforces a distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. This table shows you the trends in real level of payment entitlements from 1966 to 2018, and what you can see is there's been no real increase in New Start at the unemployment benefit since the mid-90s. And the other things to say that is the payments, especially the unemployment allowance, New Start and youth allowance, have not kept pace with pensions. At roughly $39 a day for a single person on the New Start allowance, representing about 40% of the minimum wage in Australia, allowances have become actual poverty traps, reinforcing inequality. And these payments are now so low that people struggle to pay for essentials such as food and housing, not to mention putting cash away for emergencies. And recent research done by Tony Nicholson, the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, actually indicates that low incomes are linked to higher rates of homelessness and rental stress. And in Victoria alone, this study found that 43% of rough sleepers were actually on unemployment benefits. So they were actually being supported by our social safety net. So the payment level, the adequacy of the payment level is not the only thing about our social security system that's problematic. Increasingly, as many have noted, it's become incredibly conditional and stigmatising. So the fundamental aim of the social security system as we have it is to push people out of the system rather than supporting them through periods where they require support. And it's particularly acute for young people, but also other cohorts as well. And with the conditionality, we see the rise of drug testing, we see the systematic exclusion of certain groups from the system itself. So in short, I would argue it's a system that's building precarity rather than stability and equity. The system itself is creating the conditions for inequality, poverty and disadvantage rather than the conditions for equity and flourishing. So now I'd like to illustrate some of the impact of this through the story of two young Australians, James and Nick. And these two young men were born in the inner city suburb of Fitzroy in 1990, and the Brotherhood of St Lawrence commenced what was now been a 28-year study of all the babies born in Collingwood and Fitzroy in these two suburbs.
You don't have a proper residential address, they're not going to employ you.
A Bachelor of Science with a major in Neuroscience and Diploma of Modern Languages in Mandarin.
In 1990, the Brotherhood of St Lawrence began a longitudinal study of children born in Fitzroy, an inner-city suburb of Melbourne. The study looks at how low income and other disadvantages affect Australian children. This suburb was chosen because of its wide range of different family situations, incomes, and ethnic backgrounds.
James, I'm 27, I'm part of the Life Changes study. I was just moving house all the time and shuffling around and just got sick of having to make friends all the time and starting school, so I just left school. My mum died when I was young and I ended up being put into the government's hands and I just ended up giving up, stayed home for about a year or so and just got a job at Macca's and started working.
I'm Nick, and I'm 27. I worked for an international college in the city, recruiting international students. And as part of that job, I actually got sent to China, and that was a pretty eye-opening experience for me at the time. I think I was still only 17 when I got sent over. So then from then, I went travelling for a little bit, and then I came back and I went to uni because I thought for the future I'd be better off. I was living at home, so I just attended Melbourne Uni, so it was pretty convenient. And then for the next 4 years I was at uni. Bachelor of Science with a major in Neuroscience and Diploma of Modern Languages in Mandarin.
I've done a bit of hospitality, retail, car detailing. I've just picked up work wherever I can. It's always been most casual. Yeah, I've got a massive job gap in between not working. I look for a lot of full-time work, but most of it, they want you to have 2 years experience, which I don't have. But no one really knows what it's like when you're unemployed and looking for work. It's hard because it comes down to experience and everything, and if you don't have a proper residential address, they're not going to employ you if you can't provide where you're going to be living and everything.
To go get a job directly with what I'd studied, it wasn't really viable at the time, and I think more so now. And so I had an opportunity to go to China, so I thought, as far as a career goes, probably focusing more on my Chinese is more important than my science. So then I went to China for a year after finishing uni. When I came back from China for the second time, particularly, I noticed that a lot of my friends were struggling to get jobs, and they'd already been out of uni a couple of years. So then I thought, either I can try and do the same thing as them, or I can do something a bit different. And by doing something a bit different, I thought, well, it's either now or later, and I had the opportunity to do it now, so just do it now. And that's when I got into freelance tour guiding. If it wasn't for my parents and me being able to stay at home, no chance I could have done what I've done now. Because there's times, money doesn't come in and it's a bit of a struggle, but you're doing all this work and you're spending a lot of time. So if it wasn't for them, it wouldn't have happened.
I don't have anything for that. Just on Centrelink, which is barely nothing. Struggled through. I've been in boarding houses, refuges. I've always wanted to just get by my own. It's hard because it's hard to get a job when you don't know where you're going to be living tomorrow. It's emotionally challenging. Trying to find a roof over your head and get a job to pay the rent to get a house.
5 years. Hopefully the business will be a lot more established and settled. And as far as my life, I'd like to be not working too hard, but working smartly. But I can also enjoy my spare time.
I'd love to be driving trucks in 5 years from now and have my own house and be my own independent person. Find somewhere of my own to live. And start making my own sort of life for myself. I'm pretty positive I can do it.
So 2 young adults, I'm sorry about the sound in relation to that, but hopefully you can get a bit of a gist of the story of those 2 young men, James and Nick, born in the same suburb of Melbourne and the same year in 1990. It's challenging, isn't it? Both are now struggling to secure decent work in a changing labour market, with the decline in entry-level jobs and a shift away from manufacturing to service and knowledge industries. Changing forms of employment contracts and conditions propelled by technological change and globalisation, and the emergence of the gig economy. Underemployment is growing, and so too unemployment among some groups. And at the same time, both James and Nick experienced the changing housing market in Australia with declining housing affordability, declining home ownership among younger generations, as well as static or declining public housing. Over the past 50 years, real dwelling prices and rents have increased faster than earnings. So both these young men have clear ambitions for their futures. They're motivated, ambitious, reflective. Both have navigated and are navigating very different life trajectories with very different access to opportunities, resources, networks and relationships that might enable them to thrive. Born into a relatively wealthy, loving and stable family and who provided him with secure housing, stable income, support to access education, Nick has relied on and continues to rely upon his familial safety net, which provides him with a secure home base, access to income when needed, and access to personal support and familial networks to pursue his employment and broader life ambitions. In short, he has access to human capital development as well as social, cultural and economic capital that provide him with less of a safety net and more a springboard to get a foothold into work. And despite increasingly tenuous connection between post-secondary education and work, with graduates taking on average up to 4 years post-graduation to secure work in their field of study, Nick, with the support of his family, has some value and confidence and self-worth to choose the life he has reason to value. In total contrast, James's journey has from the start been punctuated by loss, by limited family support, insecure housing, unstable income, which compounded his tenuous connections to education. Like up to 80% of his peers who have a history of engagement in the child protection system, he has experienced and continues to experience homelessness and early school disengagement. And as the BSL and the University of Melbourne Social Exclusion Monitor reveals, that as an early school leaver, James is 2.5 times more likely to face social exclusion in his adult life. Lacking both access to human capital development through high quality education and training, as well as social and economic capital afforded by a family that Nick can fall back on, James has been from a young age forced to rely on Australia's social welfare system to address some of his most basic human needs for food and shelter and social protection. Circumstances have dictated that from an early age he has had sustained connection with the welfare system through the state-funded, not-for-profit provided homelessness and child protection system and the federally funded income support system provided through Centrelink. As his current circumstances attest, this exposure to the welfare system has not raised him out of poverty. This is hardly surprising. So then, how can we design a social welfare system, and in particular a social security system and income support system that builds equity rather than perpetuates inequality? Well, the answer to that is longer than we have tonight, but I'd just like to make a few comments. So there are some obvious solutions. Simplify the payments, raise the rates of New Start in particular, as well as the youth allowance, increase Commonwealth rent assistance because it's failing to keep pace with the real cost of rents and the declining rates of housing affordability, grandfather negative gearing, address the issues around capital gains tax and reduce the harsh conditionality. All hold promise, I believe. However, unless these are underpinned by a vision, values and a principled approach to social security reform, I believe they're destined to tinker with reform and arguably miss the point highlighted in the stories by James and Nick. And this is the point, that income alone, education alone, access to housing alone, a supportive family and deep connections and networks alone will not address individuals' inequality and poverty. It is, in fact, as Pierre Bourdieu, together with Amartya Sen, suggest, it is the combination of these factors, of housing, of income, of family support, of education, access to education, and of the capacity to choose what you want to do and be in life, that actually had the lasting effect and shifting the dial on poverty and disadvantage and indeed inequality. But there are other reasons why I believe that simply raising the rates or fixing the Commonwealth rent assistance is no longer fit for purpose for changing the rules of the social security system to address inequality. And that is most clearly because of the changing nature of the labour market itself, which is unable to now guarantee the economic security that we all need. And so we need an approach in our social security system that is going to create economic security for when each of us, any of us, all of us, can fall on hard times. So in thinking about what we should do about this, about a principled approach to reform of social security, we're fortunate that others have gone before us. Earlier this year, we held a conference with a number of people on the Henderson work, the Henderson Poverty Inquiry, reflecting back on 50 years since Henderson released his landmark report. And as part of that work, we were directed back to the Henderson's principles around poverty alleviation and social security. And I just highlight some of these glorious principles cast in the early 1970s about how to address poverty. And the first is that every person has the right to a basic level of security and well-being, and all government action should respect their independence, dignity and worth of every individual. The second principle, that people have equal opportunity for personal development and participation in the community, and that need should be the primary test. But there have been others besides Henderson who've pointed the way for a principled approach to the reform of social security. And I take us back to Bill Hayden. I was going to take us back to some of his other predecessors. However, Hayden's quotes are glorious enough. And where he says that his vision was quite expansive, creating dignity and opportunity for fulfilment and guaranteed income are at its core. He wasn't talking about a basic income as we know it today, but a guaranteed income nonetheless. And these ideas are at the heart too of the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's capability approach, which is at its heart a minimal theory of justice. And Nussbaum and Sen talk about the freedom for people to have the reason to live a life, to have a life they have reason to value. And they emphasise the development of capabilities, the beings and doings that people are able to achieve. And at their heart, following Hayden and also Henderson, they consider that it's absolutely essential to focus on the freedom that a person actually has to do this or be that, things that he or she may value doing or being. So we've looked to the human rights and the capabilities approach of Nussbaum and Sen to provide a conceptual framework to guide our thinking about systemic arrangements from the level of practice of social welfare through to social security design and delivery, to the institutional arrangements, the partnerships, the links and the governance and policy conditions, the commissioning, the funding and the regulation that enable people to flourish. In regards to the social security system, this means that the conditions that enable people to access, engage and attain meaningful capabilities and qualifications that expand their options to pursue their pathways to sustainable, meaningful work or other forms of participation and engagement. And in relation to James, what might this mean is that we look beyond simply income support, access to housing, etc., and look to the combination of capabilities that he requires for him to be able to live a life that he has reason to value. Critical to this approach that I think really needs underlining is the emphasis on choice and agency. Because in the story of Nick, what we see is a young man whose capacity for choice and agency has never seriously been compromised. However, if we think of James's story, his capacity for choice and agency, his capacity to build a life that he has reason to value has been seriously compromised by the circumstances of his birth, his upbringing, his experience of the labour market, his experience too of the social security system itself. So choice and agency is absolutely fundamental to a reformed notion of the social security system, and not just for reasons of social justice, freedom and rights, although this of course is valid, but because agency actually is intrinsically motivating. Giving people choice and agency requiring them to make choices for themselves, to build personal investment and commitment required to maintain education and work is actually transformational. This in turn leads to better outcomes, greater sustainability, more productivity, as well as increased well-being, self-confidence, connectedness, etc. So the provision or the enablement of agency and choice is actually transformational in a redesigned social security system. And of course, whatever we do in relation to this system, it's embedded in place, because the place affects the way that people have the opportunities to develop. We think that we need to look at 3 dimensions to it. We need to look at individual capability, what people want to do and be. We need to look at the external environment that enables people to exercise their capability, their housing, their transport, their health and well-being, their vocational guidance, their opportunities for networks. And we need to look at the partnerships and policy levers required to enable the development of capabilities and agency. If I'd had more time tonight, I would actually be able to step you out some of the ways that we've tried to give effect to these sorts of ideas in working with people in active labour market programs, in student accommodation for homeless young people, for young people exiting out of home care, where we intentionally build the resources, opportunities and networks for those young people to thrive in their communities, where we engage in reciprocal relationship with those young people of mutual value and mutual support to try and enable them to thrive. One of the things that we observed at the Social Security Conference was a comment made by someone about the limits of social security in affecting change. And I think if there's one thing I could underline about this conversation about reform, is that the social security system alone can't transform the dimensions of inequality. And one of the things that we've given a great deal of thought to at the Brotherhood is what are the enabling conditions and the areas in which that we have to address to look at how we can do that, how we can promote a fair, just and compassionate society. Now you probably can't see all of the dimensions on this, but one thing we've realised is that to achieve this goal requires us working across multiple levels. And because these levels and domains are experienced by individuals in their life. So you need to think about social infrastructure, inclusive work, economic security and social security, and you need to think of them simultaneously. You might be working on one policy and program area in particular, but each has a bearing on the capacity and outcomes of people. So if we just took protection of human rights, if there's no protection of human rights, then our capacity to have inclusive employer practices, enabling job assistance, etc., will be deeply compromised. So I think the thing to underline is that in addressing inequality, the social security system is but one part of a broader range of reforms that are required to effect change. Thank you.